This represents 10 kilograms of plutonium, okay? See all that board and this board and that board, and keep going up the hall and walk down the hall. That would represent the amount of plutonium. Oh, I'm sorry. It's the amount that needs to make a bomb big enough to 10 kilos. I mean, it's not this size, but 10 kilos can blow up a city. That's what you need to make a nuclear bomb to blow up a city. If you use nuclear power, and this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, if you use nuclear power to help try to fight climate change, you would get not that much plutonium, all the blackboards, all the way down the hall. And it would be a colossal, their words, not mine, security risk. That would be absolutely tenable. The geopolitical risk, which we're not here to talk about today, is insane. You have fissile materials that are deadly. You have a world where terrorists want to get their hands on them. What in heck are we thinking about promoting a technology that will not only get the fissile material all over the world, but will also get the know-how and the technological know-how to use it? France, perfect example. Why do you think they love nuclear so much? Well, for one thing, they put all their eggs in the nuclear basket. 80% of their power, 80% is nuclear. So they're sort of, they dug themselves so deep in the hole they cannot get out. But more important than that, it's their major industry of export. That's how they make their money. My family's French, I'm French, I love France, the croissants are fabulous, great for the champagne, use that. Don't export your nukes. They're, by the way, going all over the Mideast, you know, to Syria et al., saying, oh, get nuclear power plants. I mean, seriously, what could go wrong? So, so that's France. There was one other point on the dumping of nuclear waste on low-income countries. I heard about the little Somalia pirate stuff going on lately. Well, uncovered part of the story, but it's in the UN reports. Somalia became a big nuclear waste dump for European countries for their nuclear waste. They would just go and illegally dump nuclear waste onto the shores of Somalia. And people, lots of people, thousands of people became very, very sick. That wasn't the only problem. There were also other kinds of pollutants dumped and a lot of overfishing from the fleet, so there are no more fish and the fishermen are starving. But there's an environmental story going on underneath the pirate thing. Not that our little thing wasn't cool when we did the rescue. University of Albany, they determined that if you simply put solar panels on the certain amount of the Westchester, New York City, and Long Island parking lots. You know, have you ever gone to a parking lot where they've had solar panels? They just have like a little rod and there's like a little solar panel. That would take away all the electricity produced by nuclear Indian Point in Westchester, New York. Okay, so I'm going to try to race through stuff here so we have time for some questions. My area is basically sort of a dumbed-down version of what the heck is a nuclear power plant, because so often I find that people are really overwhelmed by the complexity and sophistication of things such as nuclear power, and they hear one expert say one thing and somebody else say something, and then they go, oh my God, I can't understand this. But think of what's happened with our global financial implosion. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room, myself included, was very confused by ideas like securitized mortgage instruments and CDOs and collateral debt obligations, you know, about a year ago. Now that it's come out and we look at them and we know a little bit more about them, we're like, oh my God, this is really dumb. And if anybody had sat and really thought about it, it was stupid. And that's exactly what nuclear power is. It's stupid. A couple of points just before I go into the concepts of disaster science here. I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with Indian Point if you live in this area. It's 24 miles north of New York City in Buchanan, New York. And about 6 minutes before American Flight 11 slammed into the World Trade Center the morning of 9/11, that plane just whipped right past Indian Point. So right after that happened, a lot of people started to wonder what would have happened if the plane banked left and smashed instead into Indian Point. Well, the federal government's own figures, their own calculations, indicate that a major radiation release out of Indian Point would result in 44,000 near-term deaths from acute radiation poisoning and 518,000 long-term deaths from cancer. That is conservative figures, by the way, very conservative. The deaths would occur all the way going pretty much down throughout lower Manhattan because the Hudson River basically funnels the plume, would funnel the plume downward. That's where the airflow is. So like we'd all be history if we were sitting here. The Program on Science and Global Security out of Princeton led an 8-institution team study a couple years ago to look at the possible effects of a hit on Indian Point spent fuel pools. And there are various ways you could use that. Some people think that the dome is what's scary about nuclear power plants. It's not. The dome just looks scary. What's scary in terms of what could really like kill everybody in sight is the spent fuel pools, because that's where all the nuclear waste is held. And basically glorified pools, like without any kind of robust covering or anything. And they determined that the radiation plume, if you could start a fire at one of those pools, would basically wipe out the entire New York metropolitan area. Their assessment was 75% of New York State. A similar study done by the Institute for Resource and Security Studies came to pretty much the same conclusion and specifically identified Indian Point spent fuel pools as vulnerable to a plane hit. Just a quick, brief note on the plane thing, because it's sort of important to think about this. A Boeing 747 is 3 times as large as the planes that hit the World Trade Center. It weighs 910,000 pounds, carries 700,000 gallons of fuel. An Airbus 380 that they're going to be building more and more of is even much bigger than that. It weighs 1,235,000 pounds and carries 81,890 gallons of fuel. So basically 4 times pretty much the hit. Now imagine 2 planes going to any nuclear power plant. You don't want to forget about the dome, which is vulnerable too. Hit the pools, which are not protected. Okay, you start an exothermic fire, and unlike any other disaster that's ever hit the world, the difference would be that you not only kill a lot of people, which by the way a chemical plant attack could do. You could kill out 1 million people easily by hitting some of the chemical plants across the Hudson from New York City. The difference is that the area, not any area that you hit, is gone for hundreds of years. Chernobyl, the dead zone there, which is about 100 square miles, they're figuring somewhere between 300 and 900 years the area will be habitable again. So imagine an accident of similar magnitude, not even bigger, hitting any major American or any other world metropolitan region. You just wipe out the region for as long as we can imagine. Dr. Gordon Thompson, by the way, the director of the Institute of Resource and Security Studies, described nuclear power plants as pre-deployed nuclear weapons awaiting activation by our enemies. So let me jump away from terrorism now, because I think to some degree we've all had enough of being scared about terrorism for the last 8 years. Let's just focus on the issue of safety for a minute. What is a nuclear power plant? It's a machine. It's a machine where many of its systems are subject to enormous amounts of pressurization, extremely high levels of heat. Some areas are hit continually with radioactive bombardment. Okay? Nuclear power plant is also a very big, very complex machine with millions of parts and components, some big, some small. Some of the parts are visible, many are not. And there are literally hundreds of miles of cabling and pipes and other buried components and systems that are either buried or embedded in concrete and inaccessible and unviewable for as long as the plants operate. And over decades and decades of operation, these parts will become corroded or rusted or gummed up or frayed or embrittled, and they will be weaker. So one day, even if it was a smart and strapping part to begin with, one of these aging parts will be subject to a pressure it cannot withstand. And it bears mention with Indian Point in particular, since that's our neighborhood plant, that it was planned originally to operate for 40 years, as were all the plants in the United States. But they're making $2 million a day from the plant. So its owner, Entergy Corporation, is applying for relicensing to continue running it till it's 60 years old. Now, it's already one of the most problem-plagued plants in the country. It's had explosions, it's had fires, it's had nuclear leaks, it had problems with its control rods. A few years ago, both of its emergency backup systems went down at the same time. A lot of problems. So what could possibly, you know, what does it mean to have a plant run for 60 years? Well, the truth is absolutely nobody knows, because it's never happened. Plants have never been pushed that far. Anyway, what I'm here to talk for today is about disaster science. Because if things go wrong with machines is a given. Things will always go wrong with machines. The question is, when and why do things going wrong become disasters? And I'll cut right to the chase. There's one answer, okay? If you have any notes to take from what I'm going to say, this is it. Get your pens out. Ready? Human beings are screw-ups. Let me clarify that. Human beings are screw-ups. It is the cardinal principle of disaster science. It runs through absolutely every single calamity, whether accident or policy, through all of recorded history. And if you think about it, even applies to the global economic meltdown. And interestingly enough, this principle has a first corollary that's a light bulb joke, okay? How many engineers, nothing personal, does it take to change a light bulb? Answer, none. Because the computer modeling calculations definitively showed that the light bulb would not run out for 70 more hours. So together, the basic principle and its corollary mean that people make mistakes, and sometimes even the smartest people, in fact, frequently the smartest people, delude themselves into thinking that they don't. And that's the problem. And what I find particularly fascinating about, oh, by the way, I forgot to say who I am. My area of expertise basically is in why people screw up. I mean, that's, I worked as a trial attorney for 20 years, and then I went into investigative work, and then I study accidents. So that's my area, and I represented many of the wonderful large corporations that caused some problems. But the same patterns appear over, if you study this area, in any areas of accidents, it's the same patterns over and over and over again. Sometimes it's just one single, just tiny little error that creates a disaster. Some of you may remember the 1999 $120 million Mars climate orbiter that, you know, was jettisoned up into space, and in a blazing moment of glory became a $125 million piece of space junk. Why? Because one team of engineers was using the basic American units of measurement, and the other group of engineers was using the metric system. So there's this little trajectory area. These are NASA scientists working in America for a $125 million satellite, and that's what happened with that. Brown's Ferry, example of how one little error can be just unbelievably stupid. They're just stupendously. While certainly 3 Mile Island gets all the press, Brown's Ferry was really the accident that got a lot of people in the financial community to say, I don't want anything to do with nuclear power. Happened a few years before 3 Mile Island, and there was an explosion and a fire that burned for nearly 7 days, and it disabled nearly all of the emergency cabling in the plant. And luckily, you know, it was in Alabama, so I guess luckily for Alabama, they were able to jerry-rig something and got the whole mess under control. But how did it happen? Well, a bunch of electrical engineers were trying to ascertain if there were any leaks from some lines where there might be fire insulation missing. And in what brilliant way were they testing to find out if there were gas leaks? With a candle. 3 Mile Island, by the way, is a great example of a cascade accident, where you have like one little thing, essentially a valve that had got stuck in the partly open position, and everybody thought it was closed. So all these decisions were made based on thinking that the valve was in a different position, and there was also a problem with the control light that gave misleading information on the control panel. But basically over 3 days, you just had one thing flowing from another thing flowing from another thing just because of this one little poor valve. And the end result, you had 140,000 people flee. A big medical issue that did occur there, a lot of infant deaths after the incident. Another major commonality of major accidents, it is usually not the main systems or primary safety systems that fail, because engineers and operators of machines pay a lot of attention to primary systems. It's usually the small, seemingly inconsequential components that people just really aren't thinking about that bring about an accident. I call it's the small things rule. The Big Dig tunnel collapse in Boston. Remember that a couple years ago? Big Dig was a huge project. Billions were spent. Bechtel and a whole bunch of giant, highly experienced engineering firms and contracting firms were on it. The state regulator was overseeing every single step, looking through all the blueprints, inspecting all the steel and so forth. But then 26 tons of ceiling fell on some poor woman and crushed her to death because they used the wrong glue to help hold up the ceiling panels. So this mistake passed unnoticed by absolutely every single entity working on the project. 2 years ago, Midtown Manhattan, remember, for those of you New Yorkers, remember the steam pipe explosion, which left a 40-foot by 20-foot crater in Midtown, around 42nd Street area? Also caused essentially by bad glue. There was some resin that had been used to plug, a chemical resin used to plug a pipe joint, and it leaked into two tiny little drain covers that were supposed to allow steam to release. So they were clogged up. And then because there was a heavy rain, there's a lot of water that had collected in the main, which is very hot, and it got very, burst into this big pressurized steam water event called a steam hammer, where it comes up, except it couldn't get out the two little traps because they're clogged by glue, so you had the big explosion. Now, in the field of risk analysis, there's also something called the Black Swan. When people think of swans, they think of white swans. They just forget that there are black swans. So it's essentially the unrecognized variable. Or put another way, in the immortal words of former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, there are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are unknown unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know. He was, of course, describing why Afghanistan was going to hell in a handbasket following our invasion. But, if you think about it, the Afghanistan mess is just another example of the human beings are screw-ups principle. And, of course, I'm not talking about our troops. I'm talking about our dear leaders. Which brings us to the crucial question, why do people screw up? Yes, sometimes people are just careless or incompetent or nuts. But when you're talking about complex systems and big projects that involve lots and lots of smart people and experienced experts, there are almost always three dynamics at work. Okay. The first is that people at the top of the pyramid, people calling the shots, are inevitably heavily invested in the project going forward as planned. So they really aren't interested in hearing about having the plan questioned or delayed, much less derailed. The second dynamic at work is the way ordinary internal organizational pressures create groupthink. Even workers who haven't drunk the Kool-Aid tend to second-guess themselves. If they speak out, they're marginalized, and as unfortunately you know, if they make a big fuss, they get shown the door. Third force is something we call money, and this is the most powerful force of all. The expenditure of money provides incentive to cut corners, especially on the small inconsequential things I talked about. And the lure of money, particularly big money, provides a huge incentive to ignore risk. Again, can you say Wall Street? Okay, let me end with two examples, a full century apart, of these three prime forces in action. The Titanic. The famed Titanic was designed to be unsinkable. Its builder, Harland and Wolff, was one of the most highly experienced shipbuilders of its era, and it planned the Titanic to be a vessel of the absolute utmost opulence and safety. However, Harland and Wolff's ambitious plans forced it to reach beyond its usual suppliers of rivet iron, and it contracted with some smaller forges. High-quality riveting back then took an exceptional degree of metallurgic skill. It actually still does. About 3 million rivets were used on the Titanic. The strongest rivets, made of steel, were used in the Titanic's central hull. This is where the stresses were expected to be the greatest. But the builder cut some corners with the rivets used in the bow. These rivets were made of iron, and it was the bow that struck the iceberg. An expedition that examined the Titanic in 1996 found something very surprising. The ship had not been torn apart by a large gash, as had been believed. Rather, the wreckage revealed 6 very narrow slits where the bow plates had just popped. And the rivets apparently popped along the seams, letting the seawater rush in under very high pressure. And the damage ended where the rivets transitioned from steel to iron. It's exactly at the spot where they figured they could use the cheaper rivets. Okay, now fast forward 100 years to the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. Now, during 70 previous launches of the Space Shuttle, there had been at least 7 documented cases of the shuttle's foam wrap falling off and hitting the shuttle. And nothing really had happened. So the NASA scientists were lulled into complacency. In disaster science, this is known as normalization of deviance. So when a foam tile broke off the Columbia during its January 2002 launch, the flight director told the Columbia crew that the debris strike was so insignificant it was, quote, not even worth mentioning. There is absolutely no concern for reentry, end quote. That's what he told the crew. Some of the lower level technicians and scientists weren't so sure, though. So they brought their concerns to the higher up, people at NASA. But the mission managers, they were very, very, very dismissive. If you read the transcripts of which were taken at the meeting notes, they were just really poo-pooing the whole thing. The report of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board that ultimately was done concluded that NASA was riddled with a keep-it-flying culture, groupthink, complacency, and a disregard of the reality that the shuttles were aging machines that were operating too long due to cost considerations. Notably, even after the accident, at a February 2002 press conference, the program director still discounted the foam as the cause of the accident. And as it turned out, a computer program that helped NASA mistakenly decide that Columbia hadn't been harmed by the falling shuttle was based on a completely flawed assumption. That assumption was that the composite that the outside of the shell was made of was just too tough to be damaged by something as light as the foam. Now, the computer modeling had been done by the manufacturer of the composite, the Boeing Corporation, which of course had a huge financial stake in erring towards overconfidence about its product. Well, finally, after about literally 1 million computer simulations were run, and it showed that the space shuttle couldn't possibly have broken up, they decided to do 2 actual, real physical world tests. They shot a 1.7-pound piece of foam at a mock-up of the shuttle wing at 531 miles per hour, which was roughly the speed of the foam that hit the real shuttle ring. And the first test, they shot it out, and it just came out with a tiny little fissure. The second test, they shot it out, and it created a square foot size hole in the shuttle. The press reports related that the engineers gathered around, gasped in shock. And the moral of that story really is very important, because it shows that who's more smart than space scientists? I mean, our space scientists were so blinded by wishful thinking that they basically forgot about the basic law of physics called kinetic energy. That something really light, when it's going really fast and hard, can break through something really heavy. Okay, so I'm going to try to get some questions. So I'm going to end here and skip the rest of what I was going to say.
All right. David.
Thank you. It's very interesting, very informative. I'm more worried about the state terrorists than the terrorists. The fact that we have still these huge number of warheads. Even a little nuclear war is going to probably do serious destruction to the ozone, and that's why we have pretty much the retaliatory terrorism, which of course we all abhor. But the nuclear industry, I suppose, would say that the anti-nuclear people's fault, because they're not letting us put the nuclear reactors right in the center of cities, where then we can use all this waste heat to, it'll go to good use. Of course, I'm being the devil's advocate here. We know we don't want that. So, but this, the decentralized power using, more benign methods is a virtue there. But I just want to comment. I think the waste heat problem isn't as important as global warming. No. It's a local pollution, which is serious, as you pointed out. I just want to make one other comment. I think there may still be a chance to document the radioactive emission from 3 Mile Island. Yeah, because I remember talking to a lawyer who I can't remember his name, but he was working on this case, suit, and the method might be biomonitoring, using like lichens, which actually, it's shown in the article, they actually accumulate a lot of the radionuclides, and if, like cesium, I forget the isotope, 35 years, it'll still be significant amounts there, so I just want to I'd be interested to know if anyone is thinking along those lines. That's my opinion.
I want to concur with you. There was an article a while back that burning firewood in the Northeast was releasing radioactivity from the atmospheric weapons tests. So tree sampling, etc.
Yeah, the state terrorism. There's concern with Japan, because Japan's got a lot of nuclear fuel sitting there, and they've certainly got the technology to turn that plutonium into weapons in half a year. So if they really get concerned about what's going on in Korea, we could have another nuclear power just like that.
It's a question about the economics.
if it's clear that these plants are so expensive and that the cost of an accident is so expensive, who is planning on making money with this, and why do they think they're going to make money with this?
Get the public to pay for it. I want to be clear. The vast majority of these reactors are in the South, where there has been no deregulation. We still have monopolies that produce the power, distribute the power, and sell the power. If you go off the grid and make your own power, you're okay. But if you want an electric company to supply, you get one choice, and you have to pay the rate that the state sets. So we're hostages. And the long and the short is that the power companies don't really make money off of power. They make money off of capital investment, where they get a guaranteed rate of return of 12.5%. Go and try and find 12.5% guaranteed anywhere else. They want to build nukes because they're going to spend $10 billion and they're going to get 12.5% of that out of their rate base.
I just want to jump in here, because the energy market is a very complex thing, but there is no form of electricity that is as highly subsidized as nuclear power. The industry would die tomorrow if you end subsidies. Not only that, the key point that was made before, but I want to reframe it because it really is important to know. Price-Anderson Act says that we have a product, and that when they went back for the extension of the act a few years ago under the Bush administration, on the record, in congressional testimony, you can find them saying the industry cannot survive if we do not have the taxpayer assuming liability for an accident. No insurance company. Who is the people who are expert in determining risks in the world? Insurance industry. They won't go near it. And how much confidence does the industry have in themselves? None, because they won't support themselves.
Could you put the microphone back on the table?
Sure.
There's one point you didn't make about risk, and that is the decline of the Russia was related to Chernobyl, pretty much, just like the decline of other corporations. The decline, TWA got lost because of a flight loss. So the thing, but Chernobyl was a human accident. It was planned poorly. It was carried out by engineers trying to do something, and they did it. Disaster. It turned out to be a disaster. The thing is, what's the solution? What solutions going the next step? I mean, you guys are close to it, but what's the solutions? How do we move? How do we as the community, where do we move?
Well, there's one first step that everybody that I know can agree on. And then we have to have a long conversation while we do the first step about what the second step is.
Okay.
But the first step is stop wasting energy. And how you do that best is by delivering efficiency. You do not just tell people to go change their light bulbs. You actually come around, knock on their door and say, we're here to upgrade your house for efficiency, and install it for them. We have to socially deliver efficiency at every level, and we need to start with low-income people, because they're the people who are going to be hit hardest by the accelerating costs, the accelerating costs of electricity and other forms of power, the home heating oil, all of it. So everybody agrees. The problem is it's not sexy, and guys, for whatever reason, don't understand it. So we need more and more and more female voices. I hate to be a sexist, but we care about it in a way that I just have never met a guy who prioritizes efficiency the way women do. So, we gotta step up, say we weren't waiting for you guys, we're just gonna do it, and get out there, and every guy who wants to join in, welcome, wonderful, we love you. But efficiency is the first step, and we all agree on it. And while we do it, we have time to have the discussions about step 2.
Yeah, I want to say that there actually is a very advanced statewide coalition right now that's working on they're basically promoting a program called Green Jobs, Green Homes in New York.
And I know about it's wonderful guys leading it.
Yeah, no, it's labor, the environment. Well, I'm not actually very much involved, but I've been in the discussions on it. But it's basically a program to get New York State within 5 years to go basically into I think it's 5 million homes in New York State, and do whole energy efficiency improvements to the homes. It'll be a revolutionary program, way beyond what Obama's proposing in his stimulus packages. And we could do it in New York, but we need really to mobilize and put the pressure on the state legislature and the governor to actually endorse it and make it happen.
This is the area we're really just literally calling and writing your congressmen and senators. Just pick up, I can give you the number, just the Washington, D.C. line to Congress. call once a week, spend 3 minutes once a week, and you will actually have an effect. Because the more people who are saying green jobs, green energy, put money to that, it absolutely has effect. We have a government now that really is possibly responsive to this stuff.
Right, Erwin?
I have a question, and perhaps anyone of the panelists who might have some insight into it could be of help. This has to do with sort of like the particularly dark side of the nuclear power industry, and that has to do with a couple of developments in the last decade and a half, whereby some progressive or highly prominent environmental NGOs themselves turn out to have here and there a senior staffer who suddenly becomes a convert to nuclear energy and then becomes a spokesman or a public relations advocate for the industry. And also in the same connection, we see that the nuclear industry bankrolls a lot of junk science suggesting that nuclear power is safe. I mean, it's already started in the late 40s, the early 50s, that nuclear power is going to be too cheap to measure and so on. And is there any kind of research or any light you can shed on the concrete, practical ways in which the nuclear power industry manages to do this kind of thing and get away with it, namely to buy off people from environmental organizations, and also to bankroll a lot of junk science that it gets away with it most of the time?
I think you got to have an alternative. You know, it appears now that if you don't want to call it, you got to have nuclear, but you got to have there's another paradigm. And the book that's going around there, forget
Carbon-free nuclear.
Forget any nefarious things that are going on. There's a paradigm out, carbon-free, nuclear-free, which you're passing around now, which talks about in the next 50 years we can wean ourselves from oil and coal and nukes, and it is doable. And there's great detail in the book. The guy worked, Arjun Makajani, Dr. Makajani. Worked for David Friedman at TVA when TVA canceled all their nukes. It's certainly a doable hypothesis.
There's something else.
I hear what you're saying.
No, I want to respond to you. Corporate greenwashing has been a problem for a long time. There's one source of information that might be helpful. I think that they're following this. I'm not exactly sure how closely, but PR Watch.
They've done a lot. I think the person you're talking about is Patrick Moore.
Patrick Moore, who's an industry, he's an industry shill.
Yeah.
He's not an environmentalist.
I know
on their payroll.
Yes, very much so.
The fact that the nuclear industry does this kind of thing, and you don't see serious congressional investigations of it,
and you
don't
won't.
see the Justice Department.
You won't.
That's what I'm getting at.
No, but part of the problem is that nuclear, more so than most other industries, because it's wrapped into the military, because it came out of the military, because being part of the nuclear club makes you like really prestigious in the global sort of geopolitical whatever. Nuclear is kind of its own sphere, and that's a big part of what we're dealing with.
Can I get a word?
Yeah.
This book is going to be talked about probably tomorrow morning in a session. The guy who reviewed it is going to speak. And it's called Prescription for the Planet by Tom Blees. And I'm not going to tell you all about it, except for that nuclear, ever since its inception as Atoms for Peace, has been a panacea. Nuclear was going to end poverty. Right. It was going to end war. It was going to get rid of nuclear weapons. It was going to be the basis of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, as far as I'm concerned, is pretty much broken at this point. It started out broken because it was promising nuclear power, which was a false paradigm. And now it's going to solve the climate crisis, okay? So nuclear is a panacea. He is advocating something called the IFR, we don't have time to go into that, which is part of a category of reactors called Generation 4. I just want to leave you with the image that if you look at the Roman numeral 4, it is made of the letters I and V, right? Well, that is exactly what Blees is all about. I think this book is funded by the industry in an under-the-cover kind of way. Very well written, but it's full of lies. I'd love to have like a whole weekend workshop on every lie that is in this book. And just to go back to this IV thing, you know, for IV, well, we have an oil IV in this arm, and Blees just wants to take that IV out and stick the nuclear IV in this arm and say you don't have to change a thing, you don't have to be virtuous, you don't have to worry about any kind of waste, you don't have to worry about the fact that we're taking all the world's resources for a small percentage of the population. Don't worry, be happy, go nuclear.
Peter.
There were several things. I know I've said this almost at every session, but I think one of the things that the panel is suggesting, and I think you're right, Arnie, one should emphasize the fact that it really it's not worth the money, right?
Thanks for coming.
And I'm reminded of a commoner. Using it's as efficient to heat water that way as using a cannonball to ring a doorbell. Now, I think that metaphor applies to energy systems and our use of energy in general. Now, obviously, what you're saying is right. You reduce the amount that you use, but you also do more with less. And nuclear energy ain't the way to do that. That's one thing. The other thing is that we've talked a lot about the plants and the radiation and the releases and the sloppiness of the inspection. But I think that it's another thing. First of all, I do want to know more about how it contributes to global warming, and you suggested some loops by which it actually may aggravate global warming.
Yeah, from a local standpoint, it's really when you need it the most on a hot day,
right.
You won't be able to use it. It's not like it's.
But it does also heat the waters and kill the
ecosystem
ecosystem of water.
One thing that's missing in the footprint, and particularly in the spatial footprint, is the amount of land that went to mining, and what happened to that land, or what happened to the people there, and vast tracts. You read in Mike Davis about villages where they did testing, or places where they did testing, whole places wiped out, in addition to Chernobyl, in addition to these other things.
And there's the fuel fabrication plants and all the messes there, and you know, it's on and on.
And the local messes and what they did to the local land. So land is very crucial. Spatiality is crucial.
Can I just say something about that?
The other thing one other thing I was going to say about your Miche Lee. Is that right?
Michelle.
Yeah, they didn't add the last letter.
It's a cheap.
Yeah, that's usually Michael.
The thing you said about, I'm reminded of, are you familiar with Perot, normal accidents? And in fact, 3 Mile Island is an example. You mentioned cascading, where it's not just human error in the abstract, but human error in the context of an organization where a number of people do mistakes that somehow coalesce, and then there's big trouble. I would also not neglect such factors as temporal pressures and the effect, for example, of shift work on memory and God knows what other.
And it was 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Most Chernobyl incidents occur in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
That's it. Chernobyl was middle of the night. 3 Mile Island was
Really?
middle. Yeah.
Middle
of the night.
You know, there's another problem with this Maginot Line approach, whereas if you breach it at one spot, if one reactor has a serious problem, it's going to take them all out, because no one's going to want to start up their local reactor. And there's the saying that I use. I took a little bit of Teller and a little bit of Admiral Rickover, and I came up with a saying: sooner or later, in any foolproof system, the fools are going to exceed the proofs. And somebody somewhere is going to make a mistake, and the other 199 reactors. When people see, you know, Manhattan getting taken off the grid or something like that, they're going to say, "I don't want to start mine up again." And suddenly you've got all these resources in a useless asset.
Useless, yeah.
The global warming thing is key. If anybody's really interested in that, I'm preparing a white paper for Governor Patterson, which I hope at some point I'll finish. And I can, if you give me your email, I can send you. I've read virtually the actual reports that have looked at, when you look at the issue of global warming, you have to look at the full fuel cycle. So in anything, there's no such thing as no CO2 in any kind of electric, except for passive solar. I mean, if you stand outside in the sun, then you're not, you know, of course you're breathing, so I guess that's CO2. But even if you're making a windmill or a solar panel, you're using some energy to make it. The key is what the net left over is of any kind of energy system when you're talking purely at the issue of global warming. Forget, you know, all the other pollutants issue. If you're looking purely at that, essentially, Nuclear right now is the equivalent of using gas. So it's less CO2 than coal, much more CO2 than the renewable powers. It's right now roughly what gas is. But going forward into the future, it'll keep rising and rising and rising, rising. There's an excellent report out just a few months ago from the, one of the National Academies of Australia. And what's key about this report is they were not looking at it from like an environmental tree lover perspective. This was an industry analysis for the mining industry published in a mining peer-reviewed periodical. And it basically said is because the grade of uranium, of the high quality uranium, which the ones that you don't need super huge amount of processing to make into a usable form for fuel rods, is really dwindling. It's sort of like peak oil, it's going down. So just like with peak oil, to get the uranium, they're going to have to go deeper and deeper and deeper into mining, like literally mile down, and the kind of the quality is going to be worse and worse and worse, which not only is going to be more expensive to mine, but it's also going to be an enormous, enormous power usage to do that process, which will bring it up to coal. So we'll end up where we are now.
Right. Warren's been waiting very patiently.
Right. Just want to know, is there anything in the stimulus bill for the nuclear industry, and what plans, if any, do we know from the Obama administration in regards to
Very important point that I didn't get to say, so thank you so much. There is $2.8 billion under the cleanup of the Department of Energy sites to stimulate the development of energy parks. We would like it if they were solar or wind energy parks, probably, but they are intended, at least in South Carolina and Washington State, to be nuclear energy parks. And this is where they're also hanging their hat in terms of further research on reprocessing and advanced reactors. They will want to do those research programs as actual implementation at those sites. And so it's increasing the return to the taxpayer on our investment. It's reducing the footprint of the nuclear weapons era. It's commercialization and jobs at the Department of Energy sites. And it's totally sneaking in the back door in terms of the administration massively, in the end, subsidizing nuclear and closing the fuel cycle.
And there's also been a couple times where $50 billion has popped up in subsidies, and it keeps getting beaten down.
But that comes from Congress, not the administration.
Yeah, that's from Congress, not from the administration.
Wait, was that eventually taken out, or is
No, it's back in.
It's back in now.
It's back in.
It's been out like 10 times.
Yeah, but it keeps coming back.
It's like whack-a-mole.
The form that it's in right now is
Like the thing that
fenced,
won't
which
die.
means that it hasn't been authorized yet, but as soon as they authorize it, the appropriators have already appropriated it, and keep the authorizers from authorizing something like that is like next to impossible. So we're very depressed.
Right. Peter.
I don't want to be a wise guy, but it says there, the case against centralized thermal nuclear power. Does that mean you wouldn't mind if someone had a nuclear reactor in their garage? Every family had their own nuclear power.
That's part of Generation 4, actually, or small reactors.
I know you don't mean that. But
You're right, we don't.
I'm going to make a more serious point, and that is that as you pointed out and others, this is a complex machine with all kinds of things that requires a lot of money, a big complex social organization, highly bureaucratized, highly regulated, blah, 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 you know. And so this is enormously complicated, yeah.
No, they're marketing in Japan and threatening to do it here, a 40-year basically black box that you never do anything to, supposedly, except for change it out. For small power generation, they're putting one in Alaska.
Alaska, yeah.
But while I have the floor, I want to mention that this entire book, the entire text, is available online for no charge. I hate reading online, so I own copies, but you do not have to buy this book. You can get it at www.ieer.org or at carbonfreenuclearfree.org and not have to pay for it if you want to read it.
The reactor I'm licensed on is the ALCO Reactor. American Locomotive Company, and it was going to be a locomotive. So I mean, that's from the '60s, and it's now popping up again 50 years later. You know, these ideas never die.
All I can think of is the Silver Streak, an old movie with a nuclear engine coming in.
Tim.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's no time to really have this conversation now, but I did want to encourage, there to be some move to have a forum where we talk about how we stop, nuclear power, especially, in New York, where we've got not just the prospect of, the relicensing of Indian Point, but we've also got this, this constantly re-emerging proposal for a new Gulf state.
As a paid staff member of this movement, I would totally support, facilitate, and help a Northeast meeting happen. But being in the Southeast, I can't really initiate it. And we're so understaffed right now that we don't have anyone else who would. So, that's my email address. And if you want to, put a gun to someone else's head to be the one to start this, I mean, I finally heard from Deb after years and years and years just last week. So I don't know who's the mover and the shaker, but
there's been conversations happening in in separate venues about the new Gulf state, about there's the coalition around Indian Point.
This needs to be a national discussion. It has to go on in different regions because we can't afford to all travel. So if we had a national discussion in the Northeast, it would be good.
Yeah. Okay. Our last.
I thought who lives in that area was trying to be instrumental in the state of Midtown Point.
He filed papers. New York is the only state in the country that has ever opposed in court the relicensing of a nuclear power plant, and he has in fact filed those papers, and I was in court with him. But the problem is, honestly, they have much more money, and it's good to whatever degree of roadblock and delay you can throw in their way. But what happens, because of the way that the law is structured, it ends up always in the lap of the NRC.
Right, which is what
happened. And the
NRC
is the industry baby. I mean, this is the most captive. Look, I used to do Pentagon procurement fraud cases. Believe me, I know what industry captivity is. Pentagon didn't hold a candle to the nuclear industry. NRC and the nuclear industry, they're just one little happy in bed together family. The NRC will rubber stamp anything the industry wants, which is really why, frankly, I think personally the best thing is pushing officials. I mean, I certainly agree in organizing and so forth, but push public officials, fight the money. Because right now, with this economy, that's the one argument.
You don't have the money anymore.
No, but you fight the
subsidies.
subsidies. Think of them as this little blob out of a science fiction movie that's kept alive by this little funnel, and the funnel goes to the taxpayer, and it just goes sucking in taxpayer money. If we can just squeeze off that funnel, the blob will die.
All right, I think we're over.
Thank
you so much. Yeah, for coming.
Thank you very much for being here. Yes, yes.